All right. Thank you, and welcome to my talk. The last one before our lunch break. I'm going to talk about continuous testing and release with Helm and ChartMuseum. About me, my background is both kind of the DevOps and the software engineering spaces. And I do have a bit of experience with containers in the production environment. But when I joined Susa just this past November, I actually had not used Kubernetes, and by extension, Helm. So I kind of had to get up to speed pretty quickly, although I was familiar with containers. So with that said, my talk is actually not a production story, so to say. This is coming from from an angle of a new person who's just getting used to all the technologies that are being used with Kubernetes today. And someone who also happens to like reliable, repeatable workflows and good artifacts at the end of the day. So it's kind of a thought experiment, it's kind of why would we want to use Helm and ChartMuseum together to release to our customers. So the agenda, I'm not going to talk too much about Helm and ChartMuseum because you learned it all already, right, because of our previous talks. Then we're just going to talk about testing with Helm specifically, kind of what is already provided for us. Talk about sharing. Then we're going to tie it all together with Jenkins, because that's what you came here for. We're not going to talk too much about that either. It's just any CI alternative, however your favorite, is good. And then just some closing remarks and talk about next steps. All right, yes, just some basic at Helm. You can think of it as kind of a package manager. I also really liked the Ansible comparison from earlier today, because it's really just a bunch of configs that tell you how to install something, and it can manage dependencies for you. And ChartMuseum, of course, is a repository designed especially for charts. So ChartMuseum itself, as well with Helm, they're pretty easy to use, right? Pretty easy to get up to speed working with short commands. And more importantly, they work really well together. It really is, especially for brand new technologies, the experience has been pretty seamless so far, like as far as adding a repository and being able to search. So if we want to do quick and frequent releases to our clients, what better way than to maybe not use something like just a raw S3 bucket, but plug it right into a ChartMuseum. So all you have to do is add or update a repo in Helm, and you're good to go. Just checking the time here. So why test a chart, right? Because it is a bunch of config files, and no one likes testing. And a config-only change has never, ever caused a production outage before. It's just a text file, guys. So as someone earlier, actually multiple, correctly pointed out, we have an underlying image, right? We have a container image here, but we are calling it via our chart. So it's very important that we test from this angle, because we can have a lot of flexibility. Right? With great flexibility comes great power and responsibility. We can plug in just about anything in these, in our chart, our values, and we want to make sure that they all continue to work and that we're using the correct image underneath. Okay, so with that said, we'll just jump right into testing with Helm. First off, we have a linter. Everyone has a linter. It's required, of course, to pass your linter to actually run programs, for the most part. YAML lint is, that's for YAML specifically. And it can help you in the community follow best practices, right, and consistency among your files. But is this really testing? Not really, right, because this is more of a syntax check only. It's not going to be able to test business logic for you. Like say, is the value that I am putting in this, it might pass the linter and it might be, correct type, but is it what I'm really expecting? Oh, and just this is called automatically on install and package commands, but if you just want to run it yourself, just periodically as you work, then you can just do that instead of waiting for the last step. Installing something. Install it to prod. It's being tested right now. No, but certainly for learning and of course local development, well, this is a great way to poke around. You just run the application, and I added in a couple of flags. If you do a dry run and a debug, of course you skip the install, but you can get out the YAML output that you're actually feeding directly to Kubernetes. Better yet, just do both. It's kind of a good, it's a good learning experience from this end. How do you get to Kubernetes? Of course, the cons, if you're actually having to do manual tests, you have to actually remember to run all of them, right? Time consuming, and if you're just doing local development, how many times have we been changing things in our working directory and you forget what you did between installs? Did you even remember to bump the version? Maybe? There we go, Helm Test. This is what we wanted. It's pretty easy. When you run Helm Test, it doesn't matter if you have 1 or 20, all of them will get run. And so you can test, these real deployments, these are installed because this kind of follows the RSpec model of testing, and test out all of those configurations. I say pro-con, not neutral, just because you actually don't have to run your application with Helm tests because it's just a pod definition. We'll see an example in a bit. So this can add even more or greater flexibility in your testing because you can package up some run scripts that do some fancier stuff, but now you have to maintain a separate image. So there's a trade-off. And I say, again, you have to deploy these with the chart. That's kind of a downside to Helm Test, but it's not just something to point out. And I say cleanup policies. We'll get into the definition. Okay, so here's a simple, successful test. This is actually what Helm install will do for ChartMuseum specifically, just out of the box. Right, we're just doing local storage, a port, and if you look at the annotations, what makes this a Helm test is that hook right here, the hook test success. Now what this means is that you expect this container to exit with 0 when you're done with your test. And you never want to restart. So it's pretty straightforward. The other kind of test that Helm supports is a failure test. This, of course, expects the container to exit with not 0. And what I did here is I just changed my my command. I had a typo in my flag, so this will fail because the ChartMuseum image does not recognize this flag. Little word of caution with the failure test, though. Any exit code not 0, right? So you can get yourself into a situation where your test passed because your container crashed, but it might not be why, right? Not the reason that you're testing. As a new person, I ran into this one a few times myself, so wanted to. And the other thing about the pod is, this is a pod definition. This is why you have to worry about cleaning up, because it's not part of a controller or deployment. So when you uninstall with Helm, even with purge, these containers don't go away. And of course, if the containers aren't running, you won't be able to get your logs off of it either, necessarily. So I just threw up a couple commands here. Just remember, the get pods really shows you running containers. So if you show all, then you'll see some of these orphaned test containers. It's just good to clean them up every now and again. And if you run a describe, you can get any logs that may have happened in the events log. All right, well, that was testing. So now that we're testing everything and we're super confident, how can we get it out to people? Well, you know, Helm has a command for this too. You just go to your directory with your chart YAML, and you just say Helm serve. It just works. But you're not going to do this in production, are you? No. And you might want to have more than one chart at some point in the future. I don't know, though. You know, it's your environment. We're going to share it with ChartMuseum, right? Yes, that's what we're here for. Okay. All right. So we'll just go into just kind of a simple example. Again, we're not going to really talk about Jenkins. We're just going to talk about just what you need to set up a job and what the job actually does. And you see it's really fast, simple way to kind of get up and running with this workflow, at least locally. So given a repository like the Kubernetes charts that you're used to, let's make one job to rule them all. One job that can just take a name of a chart. It'll grab the version and runs their tests and pushes it up to our ChartMuseum. So the way I did this just for demonstration is I used just a Jenkins job, no pipelines, Groovy files or anything, just one parameter, again, the chart name. And if you want this to be automatic, there are two ways that you can do this, at least with Jenkins. You can either poll a URL, looking for a file that changed, the creation time, or you can use a GitHub webhook. Okay, so pretty simple. First, you want to, and this also assumes that Jenkins has access to your Helm binaries, and because you're using Helm, we do need to make a user for Jenkins if we're running ChartMuseum in a cluster, right? Just little things to keep in mind. So we add our repositories, any dependencies, and as well as test_env is my ChartMuseum. Repo update should be redundant if it's the first time adding an endpoint, but let's do it just to be safe. And then initialize our Helm. And this is pretty much it. This is everything that we went over in previous slides. And depending on whether you just created this test environment, you may or may not want to delete it after you're done testing. And lastly, we'll just pop back up. We'll package this up, and we will upload it to our endpoint. And just for good measure, it's pretty short. This is just how the output looks with a couple of setx things removed. And since this isn't a live demo, you don't know that this is actually pretty fast. You are, of course, limited 100% by your tests, like how many tests that you're running. All right, so that was basically the setup. Just as someone coming into the project and just getting up to speed, I kind of naturally wanted to make a pipeline for local development, and then just this is what I came up with. One thing about my setup with ChartMuseum, you may have noticed that there is no authentication because it's an example, but there is something called basic auth with ChartMuseum, username and password. Certainly, depending on your environment, maybe you are not in AWS or Azure, so you don't want to use what we saw in Josh's example earlier. But certainly, for security and ease of use, the storage backend and disabling the API might be more appropriate for your environment. Lastly, I know we covered this a little earlier, but my example also does not sign my releases. This can be useful or assuring because you want to tell everyone that you are the one who actually authored and released this chart, right? So I just gave the associated commands on both the package and the install side. And lastly, if you want to take curl out of the picture altogether, There's been some buzz at Susa and a little bit in the community about maybe a Helm plugin that can make this part a little easier. So if you're interested, and just stick around for the lightning talks today, people here at Susa are going to present our idea for what we call Wheelhouse. And that is my presentation. Thanks for coming, everyone. Oh, and I have to join everybody else here. Susa is also hiring, specifically for the Containers as a Service team. It's great fun. All right, thank you. Oh, yes, questions, of course.
Really? I was just wondering, is the convention with Helm Test to bundle the test definition, like the containers that would run the tests alongside the same chart that you would normally run like in production, or would you typically have a separate bundle that basically is a composite of the test definitions alongside the actual containers you're testing? And then,
So I think what you're asking is you're asking about the container image underneath, whether it's more common to use a test image or?
well, sort of. I'm thinking, so you have those test pods that are executed with success or failure. I'm just wondering if you would generally define those with a set of charts that is isolated from the set of charts that are sort of your core application. Or would you just bundle them all together so that you can run them? I'm just curious what your experience has been one way or the other.
Okay, and actually I am not sure if there is a so-called standard or even preferred way. The best I know is that by looking at Kubernetes charts, there's a mixture. There are some who choose to only use the standard image, and then others that will go the other route where they make up this the separate test suite, the custom image. And as far as packaging them all together, I believe is what the other comment was. Yes, generally, the tests don't live separately from your chart. They generally all go together.
Have you given any thoughts to different testing scenarios? Like you might want to run destructive tests in your pipeline and then have a suite of non-destructive tests for something running in production for validation of deployment.
Upgrade testing.
Yeah, for things like testing that an upgrade happened successfully.
Okay, so I think the question here is if there are separate sets of tests depending on environment where you might not want to run all of them. I believe that's, certainly. However, I don't know if the Helm test command works that way, so to speak. If you define a test with your chart, it will get run, as far as I know. Certainly, if anyone knows differently, I would be interested to learn.
I don't think it does, but it'd be awesome if Susa provided that.
Noted.
Sorry.
I had a question specifically around contributing, in the sense that you were really interested in, the first thing that you did is like, I'm getting interested in Helm, I'm getting interested in ChartMuseum, so why not build a pipeline and why not build CI systems for this? And I think that's kind of interesting in seeing that I've seen multiple different engineers who are coming new to a project who are, the first thing that they touch has to be the test infrastructure, learning tests and all that kind of stuff. I'm curious from your perspective, is there anything that was blocking you from perhaps being like a core contributor to the project itself? Or is it just like it felt more natural to become, to do like CI pipelines and test it from the user's perspective?
Well, again, I'm biased, right? I do come from a DevOps background, so yeah, it was kind of natural, just fell into it. Partially for the local testing reasons of keeping track of what I'm changing, because I'm not going to tag and release my local development. Sorry, did I answer your question? Okay. All right. Thanks again.